During Christmas of 2013, I received this little book as a gift from my family. And it contains little notes from Cindy and each of the kids regarding their memories and sentiments and feelings about me as a husband, father, and person. And they all complete the phrase, "I love you because ... And they were very generous and very kind, and between both sides of the paper, there's like 100 of them. And, Amanda writes, I love you because you make my friends feel like family. I love you because you make up silly nicknames for us. Jenny writes, I love you because you went to all my games. I love you because you demonstrate Christ's love to me every day. And many of the notes are very personal and very exposing. The kinds of things that you never really get around to saying to people sometimes, or maybe we're too uncomfortable saying. And so I didn't read the book right away. I waited until I had some time, and I found a very quiet and solitary place and slowly read through each and every one. And I had to stop frequently to kind of muse or to dry my eyes or to just kind of collect myself. And it's really impossible to describe the myriad and complexity of emotions I felt as I was reading the sentiments of those that I love most. And I'll be honest with you, this overwhelming sense of unworthiness just kind of washed over me. At one point, Cindy writes, "You're the most Christ-like person I know." And I consider that absolutely preposterous. Because I know what's in my own heart, and I know that if others knew those things too, that they certainly would not feel that way, and they may not even want anything to do with me. And so, reading the wonderful things that my family said about me was actually extremely humbling and extremely convicting. And then as I read, and even as I was tracking along these lines, this sense of grace kind of began to grow and ultimately wash over me, because I kind of realized that while they may not know everything that I think and do in the way that God does, well, they know enough. And they're intimately familiar with all of my flaws and faults and failings. Believe me, they know plenty. And they didn't mention any of those things. Not a single one. In fact, it's like none of those things ever existed, and they were replaced with understanding, acceptance, and love. And they did not have to extend such grace, but they did so anyway. And even that is profoundly humbling. I think if my house was on fire and I had to run back in and could only grab a handful of things, I think one of the things that I would grab would be this little book with the heart on it, because it is precious to me. And grace is a precious thing, is it not? Grace speaks to the deepest and most intimate part of our souls. And the most powerful grace comes from God. Because He knows us like we know ourselves. In fact, He knows us better than we know ourselves, and He extends grace anyway. He knows the deepest, darkest secrets that we have, and yet He extends understanding, acceptance, and forgiveness. Today, I would like to kind of work from Romans 3. And I'd like to begin in verse 23, which seems almost like a hard passage to start with, and then it resolves with just such a beautiful and powerful crescendo. And it reads like this: all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God, and are justified freely by His grace through the redemption that came by Christ Jesus. This passage presents the most beautiful and wonderful of truths, and that is that grace is available from He who knows us best. And this really goes to the core of who we are, our fundamental identity, and that is that we are flawed. We are a flawed people, and deep down inside, we all know that it is true. We know this passage speaks the truth when it says, for all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. We know we fall short. We know we're deficient. We know we're incomplete. We know that we are not perfect. We are acutely aware of this, and we play all of these games with our souls to try to convince ourselves or find some way to cover up our flaws, or to come to terms with our flaws and come to terms with our failings. And sometimes we are successful. But it just seems that our inadequacies and our insufficiencies and our deficiencies have this way of leaking back out into our lives through guilt or some deep shame or acting out or what have you. Because at the end of the day, it is ultimately impossible to completely justify and rationalize everything that we do and say and think. And the ante is raised even higher or ever higher when we begin to understand that there is somebody else who's watching. That there's somebody that sees all. Because we can fool most people most of the time, and we can even fool ourselves some of the time, but we can't fool God. We can't hide from God. And so what do we do with that? What do we do with the fact that He sees and knows all? What do we do with the fact that we are completely exposed and cannot cover or hide our depravity? And some of us may be thinking, well, Pastor, that's really kind of a little harsh, isn't it? I mean, certainly there are some among us who are good and noble. And from a relative perspective, that's true. But it is not true from an absolute perspective. That none of us are absolutely good. None of us are absolutely righteous. That we're all hiding something. We're covering something. Again, it's the nature of who we are. It's our fundamental identity. In fact, if you were to ask me a few years ago, the people I admire on my short list would have been Bill Cosby. And not because I'm a fan of all his different projects and things that he's been involved in, although I grew up as a kid watching Fat Albert like everybody else, and I watched The Cosby Show like everybody else, and I enjoyed it. And in fact, I bought my Down syndrome brother a box set of The Cosby Show one time for Christmas, because he is under the impression for some reason that Bill Cosby is the funniest person on the face of the earth. But that's not why I admired him. And it wasn't even his incredible reputation and persona as being perhaps the greatest TV dad in the history of television and the wholesome image and all of that. It really started for me when one day I was channel surfing. And I caught a lecture that he was giving at Morehouse University. And he was talking about various societal issues and community and responsibility. And he was breaking down all of these issues in this brilliant way. And he was really getting to the heart of a lot of things. And he was saying a lot of things that I, even in my own mind, was trying to come to terms with and articulate. And he just did so in a wonderful way. And he was talking about how we need to evolve as a people, and not just the black community. And this was to actually an exclusively black audience, but it was really how we as a whole and as a society need to evolve. And gone were all the goofy sweaters and the corny jokes and the silly shtick and all of that. And it was replaced by this sober, serious, articulate man who really genuinely had something to say. And I found his ideas insightful and compassionate, and dare I say it, extremely moral. And I thought he was right on the money. In fact, after that, I was known to say, I may even have said it to some of you, that if Bill Cosby were to run for president, I would seriously consider voting for him. And everyone else who was in the audience, or everyone who was in the audience, because I wasn't physically there, they agreed, because the whole time they're nodding. And when he was finished, there was this rousing ovation. Now, of course, we all know the rest of the story. And I guess at some level, it just goes to show how easy it is to fool people who don't know everything about you. But here's the point that I'm really making. Even if all of these recent allegations had not come out about Bill Cosby, and there certainly seems to be tremendous merit there to those. But let's say, for the sake of argument, that none of these allegations had been made, and his reputation remained pristine. And the image that we had of him 5 years ago is the image that we have of it today. And if none of this had ever happened, deep down inside, Bill Cosby knows the truth about himself, and God knows it too. Now, none of us, hopefully none of us, have ever done anything like what Bill Cosby is accused of doing. But we've all done something. There is something about each and every one of us that if other people were to know, that shames us. There's something about each and every one of us that in a way kind of shrivels our souls and leaves us feeling deficient, leaves us feeling incomplete. And God sees all of that. Romans 3, starting in verse 9, we read, "What shall we conclude then? Are we any better? Not at all. We have already made the charge that Jews and Gentiles alike are all under sin. As it is written, there is no one righteous, not even one." And he's quoting a litany of different verses from the Old Testament. "No one who seeks God, all have turned away. They have together become worthless. There is no one who does good, not even one. Their throats are open graves. Their tongues practice deceit. The poison of vipers is on their lips. Their mouths are full of cursing and bitterness. Their feet are swift to shed blood. Ruin and misery mark their ways, and the way of peace they do not know. There is no fear of God before their eyes." The text is making the case that we all have a dark side. We all have that which shames us and causes us to shrink back from God, primarily because we know that He knows. And so what do we do with that? What do we do with the knowledge that He knows what we know about ourselves? And that leads to the next progression of thought that's in the text. And that is, this sense of our deficiency or of our own deficiency causes people to naturally long for absolution. Philip Yancey makes the statement that guilt exposes a longing for grace. I think that's one of the most profound statements I've ever read. And I think it's incredibly true. And it strikes to the heart of who we are and our flawedness, our deficient nature. And we long to be made whole. We long to be made right. We have this heightened need for absolution. We read on in Romans 3, starting in verse 19. Now we know that whatever the law says, it says to those who are under the law, so that every mouth may be silenced, and the whole world held accountable to God. Therefore, no one will be declared righteous in His sight by observing the law. Rather, through the law, we become conscious of sin. And it's speaking of this need to be whole, to be righteous, and our human attempts to deal with that. For every culture has their rituals, it seems, to appease guilt, to deal with what we know is inadequate about ourselves. And the Jews had the law and the sacrifice. We read in Exodus 30, once a year Aaron shall make atonement on its horns. This annual atonement must be made with the blood of the atoning sin offering for the generations to come. And then it goes on to explain how all these sacrifices worked and how they were to make certain sacrifices at certain times to appease and to deal with certain kinds of guilt. And in this way, their guilt would be appeased. And more importantly, they wouldn't be so sheepish around God. They wouldn't be so intimidated then by the fact that a holy God completely knows them and their sin and everything that it is that they have done. And so they can feel right with God for a while. Until once again, sin begins to encroach upon their hearts, and then more sacrifices are required. And then in the meantime, in between the sacrifices, they would do their very best to keep the law and do what's right, but all that did was exacerbate the fact that it was impossible to keep the law. Other societies and cultures have their rituals likewise to appease guilt. Things that they would do to demonstrate to themselves and whatever gods they believe in that they're not that bad. And so that would make them feel better about themselves so that they could move on and have some peace of mind regarding this existential need for absolution. Many Eastern religions, for example, can contain endless cycles of reincarnation as they reach ever-increasing states of spiritual purity. In Islam, forgiveness is found through repentance and good deeds. But one of the problems with that is it never says exactly how many good deeds are required or what even the nature of these deeds are. So you never really know if you've quite done enough to appease. And so there's always that uncertainty. There's always that unrest. And even Christians, notice that I did not say Christianity because I don't believe Christianity teaches this. But even Christians fall prey to this. For how many times have we heard the sentiment expressed, you better be good so that you go to heaven? Now, those who don't believe in God or have some spiritual way of dealing this, atheists, agnostics, what have you, also have some very interesting and creative ways of appeasing guilt and dealing with this very subject and dealing with this need that they have within their hearts and souls. Again, Yancey, who I quoted earlier, he's the one who gave me the the great line of guilt exposes a longing for grace. In his book, What's So Amazing About Grace, tells of an organization in LA that started an apology sound-off line or an absolution call-in line where people who don't believe in God and have no other way to express these things, no other way to unburden or to unload themselves, have a place where they can call in and confess their sins on an answering machine. He writes, people who no longer believe in priests trust their sins to an answering machine. 200 anonymous callers contact the service each day, leaving 60-second messages. Adultery is a common confession. Some callers confess to criminal acts, rape, child sexual abuse, and even murder. A recovering alcoholic left a message, I would like to apologize to all of the people I hurt in my 18 years as an addict. The phone rings on. I just want to say I'm sorry, sobs a young woman. She says she just caused an automobile accident in which 5 people died. I wish I could bring them back. Yancey is absolutely right. Guilt exposes a longing for grace. We are flawed. We know the truth about ourselves, and we know that God knows. So what do we do with that? Because religion and good deeds and absolution hotlines just don't seem to be doing the trick. There's this deep stain inside that we just can't seem to scrub clean no matter what we do. And the truth is, there's nothing we can do. We can't put the spilled milk back in the bottle. In fact, we're like that proverbial child whose parents find him or her on the kitchen floor, covered in milk, desperately trying to salvage whatever milk, he or she can and pour it back into the container. And the truth is that only the parent is capable of completely and properly cleaning up the mess and offering absolution to the child. We are like that child. We have made a mess of our souls, and only our Father can completely clean up that mess and offer absolution. We read on in Romans 3, verse 21, but now a righteousness from God, apart from the law, has been made known, to which the law and the prophets testify. This righteousness from God comes through faith in Jesus Christ to all who believe. There is no difference, for all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God and are justified freely by His grace through the redemption that came by Christ Jesus. God presented Him as a sacrifice of atonement through faith in His blood. He did this to demonstrate His justice because in His forbearance He had left the sins committed beforehand unpunished. He did it to demonstrate His justice at the present time so as to be just and the one who justifies those who have faith in Jesus. This passage is really intimidating for a lot of people because it's so heavy and technical and theological. However, as we begin to break down some of the concepts, and as we begin to break down some of the words, it just begins to open up to us in the most wonderful and beautiful and life-giving of ways. And it begins to communicate to us the most profoundly wonderful truth there is, and that is forgiveness in Jesus Christ. And so what I'd like to do to kind of help us make sense of this is I just want to talk about 5 words. 5 words that we find in this part of the text in Romans 3. For example, the first word we see is righteousness. Now, a righteousness from God has been made known. And of course, most of us know that the word righteousness means right relationships. And in this case, it means a right relationship with God. And we instinctively know that our sin has created separation between us and God, because this is how it works in relationships. When we wrong somebody else, when we sin against somebody, it creates separation. For example, If I were just to walk up to you and for no reason punch you in the nose, our relationship would not be the same after that event as it was before that event. Why? Because I have committed this sin against you. And so now there is some separation between us. There is some brokenness between us because I have done this thing. Furthermore, most of the time, normal people, when they have wronged someone, we kind of feel guilty about that. We kind of feel self-conscious about that. And so when we see that person or we meet that person, we kind of feel a little sheepish around them. It's hard for us to really kind of look them in the eyes sometime and look them in the face. Likewise, I think that most of us, and all of us, I think, who understand the issues that are involved, have this existential terror of standing completely exposed, spiritually naked, before a completely and totally holy and righteous God. Because we know that we cannot stand. And yet righteousness means that somehow we are made new and clean before God as if this has never happened. I didn't punch you in the face. It's back now to the way it was before. We're back now to the way we were or would have been had we never sinned ever. God does not see our unrighteousness, but He sees our righteousness that comes not from us, but from Christ. And so somehow, and we'll get to that in a minute with some subsequent words, but somehow our sin and guilt and separation has been dealt with. And so now we have righteousness, a right relationship. The next word I want to talk about is justified. The text says that in spite of our sin and guilt and separation, that we are now justified before God. And to be justified, or to justify, is the impartation of righteousness through the removal of guilt. In other words, something is done, something happens, some act to remove whatever it was that was causing the unrighteousness and take that now out of the equation so that justification can happen. And of course, we know what that act is. As Christians, it is the sacrifice of Jesus Christ on the cross. That He died on the cross and took our guilt and our punishment upon Him so that righteousness could be imparted to us. And so righteousness and justification work together. In fact, it is justification that brings the righteousness. I would add as a caveat, in light of our conversations here and how flawed we know that we are, that He does all of this knowing exactly who we are and everything that we've done, our deepest and darkest secrets, and yet He does it anyway out of His great love for us. This is how He feels about us. What an incredible thing to be loved by God in this way. The next word that I want to talk about that's used in the text is the word redemption, or to redeem. And back in the day, back in Paul's day, when he wrote this, people would have understood this word in a technical way or in a legal way. Because it was the word that was used to describe the act of purchasing a slave out of slavery or a prisoner out of prison. So if someone were to pay for someone's freedom or to purchase someone's freedom, it was then said that they have redeemed that person. And they would use this again in a legal or technical way. Now, how this would typically work is, back then, obviously, unlike today, people could purchase their freedom from slavery and prison or whatnot. Now, if someone had the money to do so, or the ability to do so, or the capacity to do so, they would do it. They would do it for themselves. And they would, be free. But the truth of the matter is this never happened. The reason that they're in prison, the reason that they are slaves is because they do not have the means to do this. So somebody else has to do it for them. Some benefactor Someone who cares about them, someone who is going to do them this great service has to come, this person from the outside, and pay this price so that they can be free. And so, of course, the image here, it begins to make perfect sense. The image here is of Jesus paying that price for us so that we can be free from bondage, so that we can be free from the future or the fate that we had. And we don't need to go into what all that is, but I think we all understand what that future and what that fate is. It's a future without God. It's a future of separation, a future of eternal death, which we get into really with the next word, and that is the word atonement. Atonement is, or to atone for a wrongdoing or a sin, is to make amends or restitution for our wrongdoings in order to bring reconciliation to the relationship. And we make amends by taking responsibility for our actions and making it right. But we all know that when somebody commits a wrong against someone, that often there's either no way to make it right or that really doesn't completely make it right, that typically there is a punishment or another consequence that's involved. In our sin against God, when we sin against Him and create that separation and that brokenness, that's the consequence. We've sinned against God, and now there is separation from Him. And for us, that means eternal separation because we can't pay our own redemption. We can't redeem ourselves, and so there's nothing within us to be able to make ourselves right with God. And so we can't fully make amends or atone for that situation. And so Jesus does that for us. He atones for our sin and pays the price so that we can be free from bondage. And then the fifth word kind of brings it all together, and that's the word faith. That through faith, God lavishes righteousness, justification, redemption, and atonement upon us. The text says that we are justified freely by His grace. That He offers all of these things free of charge through His grace. And if we reject His grace, how then can we find absolution? How then can we find forgiveness? If we, for whatever reason, don't believe it or we don't receive it, how then can we be saved? The TV drama Hell on Wheels is named and set in the little transient town that used to follow the building of the Continental Railroad, the Transcontinental Railroad. And there's a very beautiful episode entitled 13 Steps about the death of the town preacher woman. Now, the town preacher woman wasn't always the town preacher woman. Her father was actually the preacher of the town, and he started the church that moved along with the town as it made its way across the plains. But he died, and there was no one else who was willing or able to step into the pulpit, and so his daughter reluctantly did so in order that the gospel would be preached in this community. And so, feeling completely inadequate and unprepared, she does her best to share the truth as she understands it with these people and to share God's love as she understands it with these people. And in reality, that little chapel, that little mobile chapel almost becomes a refuge in this very dark and often terrible place. In this particular episode, there's this big gunfight over control of the town, and an evil man takes all of the people in the town, and he puts them in the church, and he locks the door, and he lights the church on fire. And of course, they're all saved in dramatic fashion, and everyone's able to get out, except one little orphan boy who was hiding under the floorboards of the chapel. And so, in the confusion, as everyone was, trying to get out, and as people were trying to get everyone and pull them out, nobody knew that he was down there, and so he burned with the chapel. The little orphan boy had just a year or two earlier been adopted by the town preacher woman, and so really he was no longer an orphan. He was her son, and she loved him every bit as much as she would love her own child. And this evil man was captured and was tried and was convicted. But in her grief, the town preacher woman snapped. And she went and she, in just a fit of just really, I would say anger, but it was just a very cool, intentional, deliberate act. She goes because of what he did, and she intentionally shoots that evil man, and he dies. Now, the penalty for her crime, the crime of murder, was death. The law required that she be hanged. However, everyone in the entire territory was sympathetic to her because they knew her, and they knew what she was about, and they knew what she stood for, and more importantly, they knew why she did what she did and what motivated her to do that, and all of them are thinking, I would do the exact same thing in her place. And so out of this groundswell of sympathy and support for her, the governor grants her a pardon. The sheriff grants her a pardon. And to receive this pardon, to escape her punishment, all she has to do is sign the pardon. But she refuses. She will not sign the pardon. All of the people in the town, in fact, this entire episode, are all of these people visiting her, trying to convince her for her own sake to sign the pardon and accept the pardon, but she steadfastly refuses to do so. Because in her mind, she is guilty. In her mind, she needs to pay the penalty. In her mind, she must die for her sin. And she's terrified of dying. But she is not worthy of absolution. And so, again, stricken with fear, trembling, they lead her out of the cell. And she can barely walk. She's trembling so bad. And the people help her as she makes her way to the gallows while the people of the town just stand there with bated breath, waiting to see what happened. Stricken really in horror that this is happening, and they can't believe that it's happening. And you keep waiting because it's one of those shows, certainly in the 11th hour, something's going to happen and she's going to be saved. But you just sit there the entire time and you watch as the hood is placed over her head. And the noose is cinched around her neck and the rope is pulled. And finally, as her legs kick and dangle as the life drains out of her. And the irony of the entire story is that it is the town preacher woman, the person who represents God in the community, who refuses grace and absolution because she is not worthy, because she is deserving in her mind of this penalty. And that freedom and pardon were openly available to her if she were willing to believe it and receive it. But for some reason, her mind couldn't comprehend that, couldn't come to terms with that. And in the existential anguish of her mind, maybe even in her own sense of pride and her own righteousness, she insisted on walking to her death. I think the question that we ask today is really an important one. Maybe one of the most important questions in life. That in moments of true humility and lucidity, we understand that something is wrong in our souls. And we know that God knows it too. And so what do we do with that? Some of us are like the town preacher woman. For whatever reason, we just can't come to terms with grace. And so we insist on facing whatever it is, whatever we've done and the consequences of what we've done on our own merits. In other words, we insist on carrying our own cross. And for whatever reason, we don't believe it. Or maybe for whatever reason we don't receive it. Maybe that's in our sense of pride or even selfishness or whatever. But for whatever reason we reject and steadfastly refuse the grace of God. In the image of that preacher woman, as good a person as she was, a person who, relatively speaking, was more righteous, certainly, than anyone else in that entire community. But it's this picture of this person willingly walking to death because she refused grace. I wonder how many of us, figuratively speaking, walk that same path. I wonder how many people that you know right now, in your world, in your life, in your family, your school, your workplace, your neighborhood, are walking that path. Where they may even know about God, know about His grace, but for whatever reason, they don't believe it or receive it. And again, maybe that's you. The message of Romans 3 is that, yes, we're all flawed. And yes, that takes us down a dark road. The consequences of that leads us to a very dark place. But even so, there's something within us that desires absolution, that desires and exposes a need for forgiveness. And the message of Romans 3 is that forgiveness is available full and free. That righteousness is available. That justification is available. That redemption is available. That atonement is available. That Christ has done all the work. And we can set that burden down. We can lose all that baggage if we can just believe it and receive it. And if that's something that you've never done today, I want to give you an opportunity to do that. If you don't quite understand what's involved with that, if you've never come to that point in your life when you've said, you know what, God, I desire your forgiveness. I desire your righteousness. I desire your atonement. I want to be a Christian. I want my sins forgiven so that I can have a relationship with you that starts here now, but endures through all eternity. And if you've never taken that step to place your faith and trust in Jesus Christ for the forgiveness and the atonement of your sins, then I want to encourage you today to take that step. Man, what an exciting, wonderful, beautiful thing Christ offers to us. We don't have to face the consequences of our sins, our deficiencies alone, that He takes that upon Himself, and that we can have His righteousness. And so I'm going to pray, and in a moment we're going to stand and sing. we do this every week, and it's really a time of prayer. And, if you're here this morning and you just need prayer or whatever, then you come as well. And we'll pray with you. We'll pray for somebody that you know. But really this morning, if this is you and you've never taken this step and given your sins, your heart, your life to Christ in this way, man, what is stopping you? Do not insist on being that preacher woman and refusing the grace and the absolution that God offers.